comprehension problem. In the figure, the winch is mounted on an axle and the six-sided nut is welded to the winch. By turning the nut with the wrench, a person can rotate the winch. For instance, turning the nut clockwise lifts the block off the ground because more and more rope gets wrapped around the winch. Three students agree that using a longer wrench makes it easier to turn the winch, but they disagree about why. All the three students are talking about the case when the winch is used over a 10-second time interval to lift the block 1 meter off the ground. So let us see the figure, then we try to follow what do you mean by the question here. See, in this figure we have the winch is mounted on an axle and a six-sided nut is welded to the winch. By turning the nut with the help of wrench, a person can rotate like this. Person can rotate the winch. For instance, turning the nut clockwise lifts the block off the ground because more and more the rope gets wrapped around the winch. Three students agrees about using a longer wrench makes it easier to turn the winch. Now the student 1, by using a longer wrench, the person decreases the average force he must exert on the wrench in order to lift the block 1 meter in 10 seconds. This is what the student 1 says, that if you use this wrench longer, the person decreases average force he must exert on the wrench in order to lift the block 1 meter in 10 seconds. So more the length, more the average force should decrease. That's what student 1 is saying. Student 2, using a longer wrench reduces the work done by the person as he uses the wrench to lift the block 1 meter in 10 seconds. So this length will increase, longer wrench, it reduces the work done by person in lifting the block 1 meter in 10 seconds. Using a longer wrench reduces the power that person must exert to lift the block. So power required by the person goes on decreasing. Now let us study the questions. Question number 1. Student 1 is correct because the torque that the wrench must exert to lift the block doesn't depend on the wrench length. Correct, because using a longer wrench decreases the torque it must exert on the wrench. Incorrect, because the torque that the wrench must exert to lift the block doesn't depend upon the wrench length. Incorrect, because using a longer wrench decreases the torque it must exert on the wrench. See, the torque required to move up, torque is equal to F cross into the perpendicular distance from the axis of rotation. Torque the wrench must exert to lift the block doesn't depend on the wrench length. The torque what is required here to lift this block up will not depend upon the torque this wrench, the force applied here. So like this. This is the wrench, does not depend upon the length. When you increase the length, the force average will decrease. So what is student 1 is saying? Student 1 is saying, using a longer wrench, the person decreases average force he must exert on the wrench. So average force decreases if the length increases. And the torque that wrench must exert to lift the block doesn't depend on the wrench length. The force what he applies here on the nut will be average force depends on this length. So once the torque comes up, that torque will not depend upon, it doesn't depend on the wrench length. So option A is correct, B wrong, C incorrect is wrong, D incorrect is wrong.